Logan Reid's massive frame blocked the doorway as he growled at the petite woman holding fresh bread. "I don't need your charity." But Isabella Carter wasn't backing down. She'd seen the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his twin boys pressed their faces against the window when they smelled her bakery's warm loaves. What she didn't know was that this stubborn giant was about to lose everything, that the town's food bank was closing, and that their fight to save it would crack open the heart he'd locked away since his wife died. Sometimes the biggest walls are built by those who need love the most. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 in the morning. But Logan Reid was already awake, staring at the water stain on his bedroom ceiling that looked like a twisted heart. He'd been counting the minutes until he could escape the suffocating silence of sleep, where dreams of Sarah still haunted him 3 years after the accident. His calloused hands reached across the empty space where his wife once lay, finding only cold sheets and the phantom ache that never quite disappeared. The floorboards groaned under his massive 6'6" frame as he padded barefoot to the kitchen, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the doorframe. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its familiar sound a small comfort in the routine that held his fractured world together. Through the thin walls of their rented duplex, he could hear his twin boys, Jake and Ben, still lost in the peaceful sleep of childhood, unaware that their father had already calculated how many hours he'd need to work today just to keep the lights on. Logan's reflection in the kitchen window showed a man carved from granite, all sharp angles and weathered edges. His dark hair had grown shaggy from putting off haircuts, and his green eyes held the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. At 34, he looked older, worn down by the relentless grind of being both mother and father to 2 7-year-olds who deserved so much more than he could give them. The first job started at 5 a.m. at Henderson's Construction, where Logan's powerful build made him invaluable for the heavy lifting that other workers couldn't handle. His hands, scarred from years of manual labor, wrapped around the steering wheel of his 15-year-old pickup truck as he drove through the empty streets of Millbrook, a town that time seemed to have forgotten. The truck's engine coughed and wheezed, each rough idle a reminder that another major expense was lurking just around the corner. By noon, Logan would transition to his second job at Murphy's Auto Garage, where his mechanical skills earned him just enough to cover groceries for the week. The smell of motor oil and the screech of pneumatic tools provided a different kind of torture, drowning out thoughts while his body pushed through another 6 hours of back-breaking work. His boss, Murphy, was a good man who paid fairly, but fair wages didn't stretch far when split between rent, utilities, food, and the endless needs of growing children. The third job was the worst, cleaning offices downtown from 9 p.m. until midnight. Logan would mop floors and empty trash cans while the rest of the world slept, his mind often drifting to memories of Sarah reading bedtime stories to the boys, her gentle voice weaving magic into their small world. Those memories both sustained him and threatened to break him, reminding him of what they'd lost and how impossible it felt to fill that void alone. Isabella Carter had noticed the giant of a man next door within days of opening her bakery, Sweet Beginnings, in the storefront adjacent to his duplex. From her kitchen window, she watched him leave before sunrise and return well after dark, his shoulders carrying burdens that seemed too heavy even for his impressive frame. The twins would press their noses against their bedroom window when the aroma of fresh bread drifted across the narrow alley separating their buildings, their eyes wide with longing that tugged at her heart. At 29, Isabella had learned to read people through their relationship with food. She'd grown up in her grandmother's kitchen in Italy, where every meal was an expression of love and every recipe carried the weight of family history. When her marriage ended 2 years ago, she'd used her divorce settlement to purchase the abandoned bakery in Millbrook, hoping that starting over in a small town would heal the wounds left by her ex-husband's betrayal. The bakery was her sanctuary, filled with the yeast-scented warmth of rising dough and the satisfaction of creating something nourishing from simple ingredients. She was kneading bread dough when she first saw Logan stumble on his front steps, exhaustion making his usually steady gait uncertain. The sight of him swaying slightly before catching himself on the doorframe moved something deep inside her chest. Isabella had grown up watching her grandmother feed anyone who looked hungry, believing that food was love made tangible. The next morning, she baked extra loaves of her signature honey wheat bread, wrapping them in brown paper with the intention of introducing herself to her enigmatic neighbor. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Logan was running later than usual. One of the boys had woken with a fever, and he'd spent precious minutes debating whether he could afford to miss work versus leaving a sick child. Isabella was waiting on his doorstep, her petite 5'4" frame dwarfed by his towering presence, holding a bag of fresh bread that filled the air between them with warmth and comfort. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that reminded him painfully of Sarah's grandmother. "I'm Isabella Carter, your new neighbor. I noticed you leaving early for work and thought you and your boys might enjoy some fresh bread." Logan's jaw tightened as he looked down at her, his pride bristling at what felt like pity disguised as kindness. "We don't need charity," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "We're doing fine on our own." Isabella's dark eyes flashed with something that wasn't hurt, but determination. "It's not charity. It's being neighborly. My grandmother always said that sharing food creates community." "Your grandmother never had to explain to her kids why accepting handouts was necessary," Logan replied, stepping around her toward his truck. "Thanks, but we can take care of ourselves." As he drove away, Logan caught a glimpse of Isabella in his rearview mirror, still standing on his doorstep with the bag of bread in her hands. Something about her posture, proud but not defeated, reminded him uncomfortably of Sarah's stubborn streak. His wife had never backed down from a fight worth having, especially when it came to taking care of their family. The comparison made his chest tighten with a grief that felt fresh despite the years that had passed. That evening, Logan returned home to find the bag of bread sitting by his door with a note written in careful cursive. "For the boys. No strings attached. Isabella." The gesture was simple, but it cracked something inside his carefully constructed defenses. Jake and Ben discovered the bread before he could dispose of it, their eyes lighting up as they tore into the soft loaves with the enthusiasm that only hungry children possessed. "Dad, this is amazing," Jake mumbled around a mouthful of honey wheat. "Can we have bread like this every day?" Ben nodded vigorously, already reaching for a second slice. "It tastes like Mom's Sunday bread, remember?" The innocent comparison hit Logan like a physical blow. Sarah had indeed made bread on Sundays, filling their old house with warmth and the promise of family meals around the kitchen table. Watching his boys enjoy Isabella's gift felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory, but seeing their genuine happiness made it impossible to take the bread away from them. Over the following weeks, Isabella established a pattern that drove Logan to distraction. Every few days, he'd find bread, pastries, or small containers of soup waiting by his door, always with notes that emphasized the food was for the boys. She never approached him directly again, seeming to understand that his pride was a fragile thing that required careful handling. The gifts were always practical, never fancy, clearly made with children's tastes in mind. Logan found himself looking forward to these small offerings, despite his determination to remain self-sufficient. The food stretched their grocery budget in ways that allowed him to buy the boys new school shoes or replace Jake's broken backpack. Still, the accepting help felt like admitting failure, like acknowledging that he wasn't enough for his children on his own. The breaking point came when Logan overheard his boys talking through the thin wall that separated their bedrooms. Ben's voice was small and worried as he whispered to his twin, "Do you think Dad gets hungry too? He never eats dinner with us anymore." Jake's response was matter-of-fact, in the way that children could be both innocent and heartbreakingly wise. "He eats after we go to bed. I heard him in the kitchen last night, but he was being really quiet. I think he saves the good food for us." Logan pressed his forehead against the wall, his massive frame shaking with the weight of what he thought was hidden sacrifice. His boys had noticed that he'd been skipping meals, rationing food to ensure they had enough. The realization that his children were worried about him, that they'd observed his hunger despite his efforts to shield them, cut deeper than any physical pain he'd ever endured. The next morning, Isabella was tending to the herb garden behind her bakery when Logan approached her for the first time since their initial encounter. His steps were hesitant, like a wild animal unused to human contact, and his hands were clenched at his sides, as if preparing for battle. "The bread," he said without preamble, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "My boys, they love it. But I can't keep accepting without giving something back." Isabella looked up from the basil plants she was watering, her face serene but alert. "What did you have in mind?" "I could do repairs around your bakery. Fix anything that's broken. I'm good with my hands, and I notice your back door sticks when it rains." It was the first crack in his armor, and Isabella was wise enough not to make a big deal of it. That would be helpful. The previous owner left quite a few things in need of attention. Their arrangement began simply enough. Logan would spend his lunch breaks from Murphy's auto garage fixing small problems around Sweet Beginnings. He repaired the sticky door, replaced loose floorboards, and rewired an outlet that had been sparking dangerously. Isabella would pack him lunch during these visits, always insisting it was payment for his work. Though they both knew the value of her homemade meals far exceeded the minor repairs he provided. During these quiet lunch breaks, Logan began to learn about the woman behind the generous gestures. Isabella had trained as a pastry chef in Milan before moving to America with her ex-husband, a man who'd promised her a life of adventure but delivered only criticism and eventual abandonment. She spoke about her grandmother with a reverence that reminded Logan of how he'd once talked about his own family before loss had made such conversations too painful to bear. "Nana believed that food was love, made visible," Isabella said one afternoon while Logan replaced a broken shelf in her storage room. "She said that when you feed someone, you're caring for their soul as much as their body." Logan paused in his work, a memory surfacing unbidden. "Sarah, my wife, she used to say something similar. That cooking for family was how she showed love when words weren't enough." It was the first time he'd spoken Sarah's name aloud in months, and saying it felt like opening a door he'd kept firmly locked. Isabella didn't respond immediately, sensing the significance of his admission, but when she did speak, her voice was gentle. "She sounds like she was a wonderful mother." "She was everything," Logan replied, his hand stilling on the screwdriver. "Everything or not." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful in its honesty. Isabella wanted to contradict him, to list all the ways she'd observed his devotion to his children. But she understood that healing required acknowledging wounds before they could be tended. Their growing friendship faced its first real test when Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran Millbrook's food bank, suffered a heart attack that left her hospitalized and the food bank's future uncertain. The building that housed the food bank was owned by a development company that had been looking for an excuse to reclaim the property for more profitable ventures. Without Mrs. Henderson's passionate advocacy and volunteer coordination, the food bank was scheduled to close within 30 days. The news hit the community hard, particularly families like Logan's, who relied on the food bank to supplement their grocery budgets. Logan had swallowed his pride months earlier to visit the food bank during their weekend distribution, bringing Jake and Ben with him so they could understand that needing help didn't diminish their worth as people. The boys had been fascinated by the process of sorting donations and helping elderly volunteers stack canned goods, turning necessity into a family adventure. Isabella learned about the food bank's plight from Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down from Sweet Beginnings. The news troubled her deeply, not just because of the families who would lose access to nutritious food, but because she could see how the closure would affect Logan specifically. She'd watched him grow more relaxed over their weeks of friendship, his shoulders losing some of their defensive tension as he allowed himself to accept help gracefully. The solution came to her during the early morning hours when creativity struck hardest. Isabella was pulling fresh croissants from the oven when the idea crystallized with the same certainty she felt when a recipe was perfectly balanced. She would organize a fundraiser to save the food bank, combining her baking skills with the community connections she'd been building since opening Sweet Beginnings. Logan's reaction to her proposal was immediate and negative. "Absolutely not," he said when she approached him during his lunch break repair session. "I don't want to be anyone's charity case, and I don't want my boys paraded around as poster children for poverty." Isabella had expected this resistance, but his vehemence still stung. "It's not about charity, Logan. It's about community members supporting each other. You've been helping me with repairs. This would be you, helping coordinate something that benefits everyone. I fix your door, you give me bread. That's an even exchange," Logan argued, his voice rising with frustration. "What you're talking about is putting our business in the street, making our struggles everyone's entertainment. The accusation hung between them like a chasm, wider than Isabella had anticipated. She could see the fear beneath his anger, the terror of a man who'd been let down by people who were supposed to protect him. His pride wasn't just stubbornness, it was armor built from years of disappointment and the crushing responsibility of single parenthood. "Your struggles are already in the street, Logan," Isabella said softly. "Anyone with eyes can see how hard you work, how much you sacrifice for Jake and Ben. There's no shame in that. The shame would be in letting the food bank close when we have the power to save it." That evening, Logan sat in his truck outside Sweet Beginnings long after Isabella had closed, wrestling with emotions that felt too large for his body to contain. Through the bakery's windows, he could see her moving. Around the kitchen, her movements economical and sure as she prepared tomorrow's bread. She looked peaceful in her element, and Logan found himself envying that sense of belonging, of purpose that went beyond mere survival. His phone buzzed with a text message from his sister Rachel, who lived 3 states away with her own family. The message was brief, but loaded with familiar disappointment. "Heard about your situation through the grapevine. You know you could move here. Get a fresh start. The boys need stability." Logan deleted the message without responding, as he had with the dozen similar messages Rachel had sent over the past year. His sister meant well, but her definition of stability required him to admit defeat, to pack up his children and start over in a place where he'd be forever indebted to family charity. Moving would mean leaving Sarah's grave, abandoning the town where his boys had been born, surrendering the independence he'd fought so hard to maintain. The next morning brought a crisis that forced Logan's hand. Jake woke with a high fever and persistent cough that required immediate medical attention. Logan called in sick to all 3 jobs, a luxury he couldn't afford but couldn't avoid, and spent the day in the emergency room while doctors determined that his son had developed pneumonia. The medical bills would be catastrophic even with their minimal insurance, and missing work meant no daily wages to offset the financial damage. Isabella arrived at the hospital with a thermos of soup and homemade rolls, having heard about Jake's illness from Ben, who'd been staying with the elderly neighbor who watched the boys after school. Her presence should have felt intrusive, but Logan found himself grateful for the company and the way she entertained Ben while Jake slept off the effects of medication. "He's going to be fine," Isabella said quietly, sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Logan's. "Children are resilient. My little brother had pneumonia twice before he turned 10, and now he runs marathons." Logan nodded, but his mind was calculating costs, adding up missed wages against medical bills, against rent, against everything else that demanded money he didn't have. Isabella seemed to read his thoughts, her dark eyes soft with understanding. "Let me help with the fundraiser," she said. "Not as charity, but as partners. You know this community better than I do. You know which families use the food bank, which businesses might donate, which approaches will work, and which ones will backfire. I can bake, but I can't organize a community event without someone who understands Millbrook." The proposal was reasonable, logical, and terrifying. Logan looked at his son, pale and small in the hospital bed, then at Isabella, whose steady presence had become a source of comfort he hadn't expected to find again. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but the alternative was watching everything fall apart while he clung to pride that fed no one. "Okay," he said finally, "but we do this right. No pity parties, no sob stories. We focus on the food bank's value to the whole community, not just the families who need it." Isabella's smile was radiant but respectful, acknowledging the significance of his concession without making it feel like surrender. "Partners," she agreed, extending her hand for him to shake. Their partnership began tentatively, with Logan providing lists of local businesses and community leaders, while Isabella developed the fundraising concept. They decided on a harvest festival format, combining food sales with live music and activities for children. Isabella would coordinate the baking donations, while Logan would handle logistics like permits, venue setup, and volunteer coordination. The work brought them together in ways that simple friendship hadn't achieved. They spent evenings at Isabella's kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks and lists, planning every detail of the event. Logan's organizational skills, honed by years of managing multiple jobs and household responsibilities, complemented Isabella's creative vision and social connections. They discovered they worked well together, their different strengths creating a synergy that surprised them both. During these planning sessions, Logan began to see Isabella more clearly. Her kindness wasn't naive generosity, but thoughtful compassion, backed by practical action. She understood the difference between helping and enabling, between supporting someone and making them dependent. When she pushed him to accept assistance, it was with the goal of empowering rather than diminishing his autonomy. Isabella, meanwhile, watched Logan reveal layers of character that his defensive exterior had hidden. Beneath the gruff pride was a man of remarkable intelligence and organizational ability. He approached problems systematically, considering multiple angles before proposing solutions. His love for his children was evident in every decision, every calculation about how their choices would affect Jake and Ben's sense of security and self-worth. The boys became enthusiastic supporters of the Harvest Festival, particularly after Jake recovered from his pneumonia and threw himself into helping with preparations. They designed colorful posters advertising the event and convinced their classmates' parents to donate baked goods. Isabella taught them to roll pasta and braid challah bread, filling Logan's duplex with the sounds of childhood laughter that had been absent since Sarah's death. 3 weeks before the festival, Logan encountered the first major obstacle. Murphy, his boss at the auto garage, informed him that the shop was cutting staff due to declining business. Logan's afternoon shift would be eliminated, leaving him without a significant portion of his income precisely when medical bills from Jake's hospitalization were arriving daily. The timing couldn't have been worse. Logan had been starting to believe that maybe, with enough work and careful planning, he could provide stability for his family without sacrificing his independence. Losing the garage job meant he'd have to find additional work or consider more drastic measures, like accepting his sister's offer to move. Isabella found him sitting in his truck outside the garage after Murphy delivered the news, his massive frame somehow looking diminished behind the steering wheel. She approached cautiously, recognizing the signs of a man processing devastating news. "Bad day?" she asked, leaning against the truck's passenger door. Logan's laugh was bitter and short. "Murphy's cutting my hours. Says business is down, can't afford to keep everyone. After 3 years of working for him, I get 2 weeks' notice and a handshake." The news hit Isabella harder than she expected. Over their weeks of partnership, she'd grown protective of Logan's fragile stability, invested in his success in ways that went beyond friendship. Seeing his careful progress threatened by circumstances beyond his control awakened something fierce inside her chest. "What if you worked for me?" she said suddenly, the idea forming as she spoke. "Sweet Beginnings is doing better than I expected. I could use help with deliveries, customer service, maybe even some basic baking assistance. It wouldn't be charity, it would be employment." Logan's initial response was predictable resistance. "I don't know anything about running a bakery, Isabella. I'd probably do more harm than good." "You know about hard work and reliability," she countered. "You understand customer service from the garage, and you're already familiar with the business from doing repairs. Besides, the boys could come by after school sometimes. There's a back room that would make a perfect homework space." The offer was tempting, addressing not just his financial crisis, but the constant worry about childcare during his overlapping job schedules. Still, working for Isabella felt different from their current arrangement, potentially complicating the friendship that had become precious to him. "Think about it," Isabella said when he didn't respond immediately. "The festival is in 3 weeks. After that, we'll both have a better sense of what we want our lives to look like." The Harvest Festival took place on the first Saturday in October, when autumn had painted Millbrook in shades of gold and scarlet that made the town look like something from a postcard. Isabella and Logan had transformed the community center into a warm, welcoming space filled with the aromas of fresh bread, apple cider, and harvest vegetables. Local musicians provided a soundtrack of folk songs and country classics, while children ran between booths selling homemade crafts and baked goods. Logan found himself enjoying the event in ways he hadn't anticipated. Watching Jake and Ben help serve customers, their faces bright with pride as they explained which cookies they'd helped decorate, reminded him of family gatherings from his own childhood. The boys wore matching aprons that Isabella had sewn for them, and they treated their responsibilities with the seriousness of important work. Isabella moved through the crowd like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, ensuring that every volunteer knew their role and every customer felt welcomed. She'd recruited half the town to contribute food, time, or money, turning the festival into a true community effort rather than a charity event. Logan watched her work and marveled at her ability to make everyone feel essential to the success of the endeavor. The surprise came when Mayor Davidson took the makeshift stage to announce the fundraiser's results. The Harvest Festival had raised not just enough money to keep the food bank operating for another year, but sufficient funds to expand their services and hire a part-time coordinator. The community's response had exceeded everyone's expectations, proving that Millbrook residents were willing to support their neighbors when given the opportunity to help with dignity and tact. Logan felt tears threatening as the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Jake and Ben rushed to hug him, their excitement infectious as they babbled about all the people who'd complimented their cookies and asked about their father's work organizing the event. For the first time since Sarah's death, Logan felt like part of something larger than survival, connected to a community that valued his contributions rather than pitying his struggles. As the evening wound down and volunteers began cleaning up, Logan found himself working beside Isabella to pack leftover food and stack folding tables. Their movements had developed a rhythm over their weeks of collaboration, and the comfortable silence between them felt charged with unspoken possibilities. "Thank you," Logan said, as they loaded the last box into Isabella's car. "For pushing me into this, for not letting me hide behind my pride. I forgot what it felt like to be part of something good." Isabella turned to face him fully, her dark eyes reflecting the string lights that decorated the community center. "You didn't need pushing, Logan. You needed permission to accept that you deserve support. There's a difference." The distinction mattered more than she could know. Permission implied choice, agency, the ability to accept help without surrendering dignity. Logan had spent 3 years believing that needing assistance was a personal failure, but Isabella's perspective reframed struggle as a temporary condition rather than a character flaw. "About that job offer," Logan said, his voice rough with emotions he was still learning to express. "If it's still available, I'd like to accept, but with conditions." Isabella raised an eyebrow, curious rather than defensive. I want to earn my wages, not receive charity disguised as employment. If I'm not pulling my weight, or if the business can't support another salary, you tell me honestly. And I want to learn the business properly, not just do manual labor." "Deal," Isabella replied without hesitation. "But I have conditions too. You stop calling it charity when people offer genuine help. And you let the boys visit the bakery without worrying that you're imposing. They're good kids, and they make the place feel more like home." That night, Logan sat on his front step with a cup of coffee, watching the lights in Isabella's bakery kitchen as she prepared for the next day's baking. The sight had become familiar over their months of friendship, but tonight it felt different, charged with possibilities he'd thought died with Sarah. He wasn't ready for romance, might never be ready to risk his heart again, but the friendship with Isabella had taught him that isolation wasn't protection. It was just another kind of prison. Logan's transition to bakery work proved easier than either he or Isabella had expected. His mechanical aptitude translated surprisingly well to operating mixers and ovens, while his customer service experience from the garage helped him navigate the social aspects of retail. More importantly, his genuine care for quality and attention to detail aligned perfectly with Isabella's standards for her products. The boys adapted to their new after-school routine with enthusiasm. Sweet Beginnings became their second home, a place where they could do homework while surrounded by the comforting aromas of baking bread and Isabella's patient presence. She taught them to measure ingredients and knead dough, turning practical lessons into opportunities for learning fractions and following directions. Jake, still recovering from his bout with pneumonia, found particular joy in decorating cookies and arranging pastries in the display case. His artistic eye, inherited from Sarah, brought creative touches to Isabella's presentations that customers noticed and appreciated. Ben preferred the more physical aspects of baking, helping Logan load and unload ovens and learning to operate the delivery van when they made rounds to local cafes and restaurants. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Millbrook in snow by mid-November and testing Logan's newfound stability in unexpected ways. Sweet Beginnings' heating system failed during the season's first blizzard, threatening to shut down operations during the busy holiday baking season. Logan worked through 2 nights straight, rebuilding the ancient furnace with parts scavenged from other equipment and sheer determination born of protecting what had become his family's livelihood. Isabella found him on the second morning, asleep standing up against the bakery's back wall, tools still in his hands and grease streaking his face. The sight of him, exhausted but victorious, stirred feelings in her chest that she'd been trying to ignore for months. This wasn't just friendship anymore, not for her, but Logan's emotional availability remained as uncertain as winter weather. "The heat's working," Logan mumbled when she woke in gently, his voice thick with sleep and cold. "Should be good for the rest of the season." "You could have called a professional," Isabella said, wrapping a warm coat around his shoulders. "The expense would have been worth avoiding this." Logan straightened, suddenly more awake. "A professional would have charged what I make in 2 weeks, and we'd have lost 3 days of production waiting for parts. Besides, I know this equipment now. Next time something breaks, I'll fix it faster." His assumption of future problems, future solutions, future presence in her business and life sent warmth through Isabella that had nothing to do with the restored heating system. Logan was planning beyond survival now, thinking about long-term improvements and his role in Sweet Beginnings' success. The shift represented progress in ways that went beyond financial stability. The holiday season brought challenges and unexpected joys in equal measure. Isabella introduced Logan to her family's traditional Christmas bread recipes, complex processes that required patience and precision. Logan approached the learning with the same methodical dedication he brought to everything else, asking detailed questions and taking careful notes that filled a notebook with techniques and timing. Jake and Ben threw themselves into holiday preparations with the enthusiasm that made everything feel magical despite the constraints of their budget. They made ornaments from bread dough and created elaborate plans for gifts they could afford to give. Logan watched his sons navigate the season with optimism instead of the disappointment that had marked previous holidays, and he understood that stability meant more than financial security. It meant hope for the future. The revelation came on Christmas Eve, when Logan was working alone in the bakery to finish last-minute orders. Isabella had gone to evening mass, a tradition from her childhood that she'd maintained despite her complicated relationship with organized religion. The boys were spending the night with their school friend Marcus, giving Logan a rare evening of solitude that he planned to use for deep cleaning and inventory. He was wiping down display cases when he heard knocking at the bakery's front door. Through the glass, he could see Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived alone and rarely left her apartment. Her face was streaked with tears, and her thin coat was inadequate protection against the bitter cold. "Mrs. Patterson, what's wrong?" Logan asked, unlocking the door and ushering her inside. "My heat went out," she said, her voice shaking with cold and embarrassment. "The landlord says he can't get anyone to fix it until after the holiday. I didn't know where else to go. I saw your lights on and thought, maybe—" Logan's response was immediate and instinctive. He wrapped the elderly woman in his own coat and settled her in a chair near the bakery's warm ovens. Then he gathered bread, soup, and hot coffee, creating a meal that would restore both her body temperature and her spirits. While she ate, he called his landlord, a decent man who owed Logan several favors, and arranged for emergency heating repair that evening. Isabella returned from Mass to find Logan and Mrs. Patterson sharing Christmas cookies and stories about their families. The sight stopped her in the doorway, not because it was unexpected, but because it so perfectly captured the man Logan had become over their months of partnership. His capacity for kindness, hidden for so long beneath protective pride, had emerged gradually but powerfully. "Room for one more?" Isabella asked, settling into a chair beside them with the easy grace that made every gathering feel intentional rather than accidental. They spent Christmas Eve together, 3 people who'd found family and friendship, sharing stories and warmth while snow fell outside. Mrs. Patterson talked about her late husband and the Christmases when their children were young. Isabella described her grandmother's feast preparations that took days and fed entire neighborhoods. Logan spoke hesitantly but warmly about Sarah and the tradition she'd tried to create for their young family. It was the first time Logan had shared happy memories of his wife without pain overwhelming the joy. Isabella listened without jealousy or discomfort, understanding that Sarah would always be part of Logan's story, that honoring those memories was essential to his healing, rather than an obstacle to future happiness. When Mrs. Patterson's heat was restored, and she returned home with bags of food to last through the holiday weekend, Logan and Isabella found themselves alone in the bakery's kitchen. The space felt different at night, intimate and peaceful, in ways that daylight didn't provide. "Thank you," Isabella said, cleaning flour from the counter where they'd rolled Christmas cookies. "For taking care of her. For making it feel normal, instead of awkward." Logan paused in his wiping, considering her words carefully. Sarah always said that kindness was like baking bread. You can't rush it, and you can't fake it, but when it's real, it nourishes everyone who encounters it. The comparison was so perfectly Isabella that Logan wondered if Sarah would have liked the woman who'd become such an essential part of their lives. He thought she would have, that Sarah's generous spirit would have recognized a kindred soul in Isabella's practical compassion. "She sounds like she was wise," Isabella said softly. "She was everything I needed to become a better man," Logan replied. "But I'm learning that maybe I'm allowed to keep growing, even without her." The admission hummed between them, heavy with implications. Neither was ready to examine fully. Logan's grief had been his constant companion for 3 years, a familiar weight that defined his identity as much as his role as a father. The possibility of happiness beyond loss felt both thrilling and terrifying, a betrayal of loyalty and a promise of healing wrapped in the same uncertain package. Spring arrived in Millbrook with a kind of dramatic flourish that made residents forget the harshness of winter. Isabella expanded Sweet Beginnings offerings to include fresh pasta and prepared meals, transforming the bakery into a community gathering place that Logan helped design and implement. His organizational skills and growing culinary knowledge made him invaluable to the expansion, while his presence provided the stability that allowed Isabella to take creative risks. The boys had grown over the winter, not just physically, but emotionally. Jake's artistic talents had found expression in cake decorating and food presentation, skills that Isabella encouraged and Logan supported despite his lingering concerns about practical career paths. Ben had developed an entrepreneurial spirit, proposing delivery routes and customer loyalty programs that impressed both adults with their sophistication and feasibility. Logan's sister Rachel visited in April, her first trip to Millbrook since Sarah's funeral. She arrived expecting to find her brother overwhelmed and her nephews struggling, prepared to renew her arguments about relocation and fresh starts. Instead, she discovered a family that had found stability and happiness in ways she hadn't anticipated. "You look different," Rachel told Logan as they watched Jake and Ben demonstrate their pasta-making skills for their aunt. "More settled, more like yourself, if that makes sense." Logan understood what she meant. For 3 years, he'd been a shadow version of himself, defined by loss and survival rather than personality and dreams. Working with Isabella, building something positive instead of just preventing collapse, had restored aspects of his character that grief had temporarily buried. "We found our place here," Logan replied, his voice carrying confidence that had been missing for too long. "The boys are happy, established in school and part of a community that knows them. Moving would mean starting over, and we've already done the hard work of rebuilding." Rachel studied her brother's face, searching for signs of the stubborn pride that had always made him difficult to help. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine contentment, a peace that had been absent since Sarah's death. The boys clearly adored Isabella, who treated them with the perfect balance of affection and respect that children craved. More telling was how Logan looked at the woman who'd become such an integral part of their lives, his expression holding warmth that Rachel hadn't seen in years. "She's good for you," Rachel said quietly, nodding toward Isabella, who was teaching Ben how to create decorative pasta shapes. "Sarah would have liked her." The observation hit Logan with surprising force, not because it was unexpected, but because hearing it from someone who'd known Sarah intimately made it feel true in ways his own speculation couldn't achieve. Rachel had been Sarah's friend before becoming his sister-in-law, and her approval carried weight that went beyond family loyalty. That evening, after Rachel had returned to her hotel and the boys were asleep, Logan found himself walking through downtown Millbrook with Isabella. They'd developed a habit of evening walks during the warmer months, using the quiet time to discuss business plans and share observations about their community. Tonight felt different, charged with awareness that had been building for months but never acknowledged directly. "Rachel likes you," Logan said as they passed the fountain in the town square. "She said Sarah would have liked you too." Isabella's steps slowed, understanding the significance of his sister's approval and the courage it took for Logan to share it. "I would have liked to know Sarah. From everything you've told me, she sounds like she was an amazing woman." "She was," Logan agreed. "But she's gone, and I'm learning that honoring her memory doesn't mean freezing my life in the moment she left it." They stopped walking, standing beside the fountain while water trickled softly in the background. Isabella turned to face Logan, her dark eyes reflecting the streetlights, and something deeper that made his breath catch in his throat. "What are you saying, Logan?" The question was gentle but direct, giving him space to retreat if he wasn't ready for honesty. Logan looked down at her, this woman who'd transformed his family's life through patience and kindness, and felt the last of his defensive walls crumble. "I'm saying that, somewhere along the way, you stopped being just my business partner and friend. I'm saying that when I imagine the future, you're in it, and that scares me more than anything I've ever faced." And Isabella's smile was radiant but careful, understanding that Logan's admission represented a monumental shift in his emotional landscape. "It scares me too, but good things often do." Their first kiss happened naturally, gently, with the reverence of two people who understood that love wasn't guaranteed and therefore shouldn't be taken lightly. Logan's hands framed Isabella's face with the careful touch of someone who'd learned that precious things required protection, while she stood on her toes to bridge the height difference between them. When they separated, Logan rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of vanilla and flower that always clung to her hair. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I haven't dated anyone since high school. Sarah and I grew up together, fell in love as teenagers. This feels like learning a foreign language." "Then we'll learn together," Isabella replied. Slowly, carefully, with respect for what we've both been through. "The boys come first, always. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." The promise of patience, of building something real rather than rushing toward an uncertain destination, allowed Logan to breathe deeply for the first time in months. Isabella understood that loving a widower meant accepting his past rather than competing with it, that Jake and Ben weren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to be treasured. Summer brought new challenges and deeper connections in equal measure. Sweet Beginnings' success required expansion, and Logan found himself learning aspects of business management he'd never considered. Isabella trusted him with financial decisions and long-term planning, treating him as a true partner rather than an employee who'd grown beyond his original role. The boys adapted to their father's new relationship with the wisdom that children often displayed about matters of the heart. They'd been watching Logan and Isabella's growing closeness for months, and their approval was both wholehearted and protective. Jake, ever the artist, began drawing pictures of their expanded family that included Isabella as a central figure. Ben, practical like his father, asked direct questions about whether Isabella would be staying permanently and whether they might get a bigger house. Logan's answers were honest but cautious. He loved Isabella, was certain of that, but marriage felt like a destination too distant to discuss seriously. His relationship with Sarah had been built over years of shared history, while this new love was still finding its foundation. The differences between his first marriage and his current relationship weren't deficiencies, but distinctions that required different approaches and expectations. Isabella understood his caution and shared it. Her first marriage had taught her that love alone wasn't sufficient for lasting partnership, that compatibility in daily life mattered as much as passion. Working together had shown her that she and Logan functioned well as a team, but romantic love added complexities that needed time to develop and strengthen. The turning point came in late August, when Logan received a job offer from a construction company in the state capital. The position offered significantly higher wages and better benefits, the kind of opportunity that would solve their family's financial concerns permanently. The catch was relocation, leaving Millbrook and everything they'd built there. Logan stared at the letter for hours, calculating numbers and weighing options with the methodical approach he brought to every major decision. The salary increase would allow him to buy a house, save for the boy's college education, and provide the security he'd been chasing since Sarah's death. Moving would also mean leaving Isabella, ending their business partnership and romantic relationship before either had fully developed. "You have to take it," Isabella said when he showed her the offer. They were in the bakery's kitchen after closing, surrounded by the familiar comfort of their shared workspace. "This is exactly what you've been working toward." Logan studied her face, searching for signs of the disappointment he felt radiating from his own chest. "It would mean leaving Millbrook, leaving you." "I know," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "But I can't be the reason you turn down your family's financial security. That's not love, Logan. That's selfishness." The conversation continued late into the night, both of them exploring options and alternatives that might allow Logan to accept the job without destroying what they'd built together. Isabella could sell Sweet Beginnings and move with them, but starting over in a new city would mean abandoning the community connections that made her business successful. Logan could decline the offer, but turning down financial security for romantic reasons felt irresponsible when his children's futures were at stake. Over the following week, Logan wrestled with the decision while maintaining his usual work routine. The boys sensed something was wrong, their natural intuition picking up on the tension between the adults who anchored their world. Isabella threw herself into baking with unusual intensity, creating elaborate pastries that she gave away rather than selling, as if cooking could solve problems that conversation couldn't resolve. The solution came from an unexpected source. Marcus, the town's young mayor who'd been elected on a platform of economic development, approached Logan with a proposal that changed everything. Millbrook was applying for state grants to develop a culinary tourism program, promoting the town as a destination for food lovers seeking authentic small-town experiences. The program would need a coordinator, someone who understood both the food industry and project management. "The salary wouldn't match what you've been offered elsewhere," Marcus admitted, "but it would be steady work with good benefits, and it would keep you here if that's what you want." Logan felt hope resurging in ways that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with Millbrook in the first place. The position would utilize his organizational skills while building on everything he'd learned working with Isabella. More importantly, it would allow him to contribute to his community's growth, rather than simply benefiting from others' generosity. The grant application process required weeks of detailed planning and research. Logan found himself working closely with Isabella to develop proposals for cooking classes, food festivals, and restaurant partnerships that would showcase Millbrook's culinary potential. Their collaboration reminded them both why their relationship worked so well, how their different strengths created something stronger than either could achieve alone. When the grants were approved in September, Logan's relief was matched by the entire community's excitement about new opportunities for growth and prosperity. Sweet Beginnings would serve as one of the program's anchor businesses, with Isabella teaching cooking classes and Logan coordinating events that brought visitors to experience authentic small-town hospitality. The boys were ecstatic about staying in Millbrook, but their happiness went beyond avoiding relocation. They'd watched their father struggle with the decision about moving, understanding that adult choices were complex and sometimes required sacrificing good things for better ones. Seeing him find a solution that preserved both financial security and personal happiness taught them lessons about persistence and creativity that would serve them throughout their lives. Fall arrived with spectacular color that drew tourists from surrounding cities, providing the first test of Millbrook's culinary tourism program. Logan coordinated weekend events that combined food tastings with historical tours and outdoor activities. Isabella's cooking classes filled immediately, attracting participants who wanted to learn traditional techniques in an authentic small-town setting. The success exceeded everyone's expectations, validating the community's investment in the program and Logan's decision to stay. More importantly, working together on the tourism project had deepened his relationship with Isabella in ways that pure romance couldn't achieve. They'd proven they could handle stress, disagreement, and high-stakes decision-making as a team. One evening in October, as they cleaned up after a particularly successful harvest cooking class, Logan found himself thinking about the future with clarity that had been missing since Sarah's death. He loved Isabella completely, differently than he'd loved his first wife, but no less deeply. The boys adored her, and had begun asking when she might move in with them permanently. Most significantly, Logan had stopped feeling guilty about happiness, understanding that joy wasn't betrayal but recovery. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying the nervous energy that preceded important conversations. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with your answer." She turned from the sink where she'd been washing mixing bowls, her dark eyes alert to the significance in his tone. "Always. Do you see yourself staying in Millbrook permanently, building a life here, with me and the boys?" The question encompassed everything they'd been dancing around for months. Isabella set down the bowl she'd been holding and moved closer to Logan, her movements deliberate and sure. "I can't imagine being anywhere else," she said simply. "This is home now. You and Jake and Ben are my family, the community I've been looking for my entire adult life." Logan's response was to gather her into his arms, holding her close, while emotions he'd been suppressing for months finally found expression. Love, relief, gratitude, and hope combined into something too large for words, but perfect for the embrace they shared. "Then I have another question," Logan said, his voice muffled against her hair. "Would you consider making it official? Not just the relationship, but everything. Partnership in business and life, helping me raise the boys, building something permanent together." Isabella pulled back to look at his face, searching for any trace of uncertainty or obligation. What she found was love so clear and determined that it took her breath away. "Are you proposing to me in a flower-covered apron?" she asked, laughter bubbling up despite the tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "I'm proposing to you exactly as you are, in the place where we fell in love, surrounded by everything we've built together," Logan replied. "If you'll have us." Her answer was a kiss that tasted of flower and possibility, of second chances, and the courage to believe in happy endings. When they finally separated, both of them were crying and laughing simultaneously, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were promising each other. The wedding took place the following spring, in the community center where they'd organized the harvest festival that saved the food bank. Isabella wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her petite frame, while Logan stood tall and proud in a suit that Jake and Ben had helped him choose. The boys served as best men, their matching ties and serious expressions making them look older than their 8 years. The entire town attended, filling the space with the same warmth and community spirit that had characterized all their major events. Mrs. Patterson, whose Christmas Eve crisis had revealed Logan's capacity for spontaneous kindness, provided flowers from her garden. Marcus performed the ceremony, his words emphasizing the family that Logan and Isabella had created together rather than focusing on traditional romantic themes. Sarah's memory was honored but not overwhelming, acknowledged in ways that felt appropriate rather than awkward. Logan wore his first wedding ring on a chain around his neck, a symbol of love that would always be part of his story, but didn't diminish his commitment to Isabella. During the ceremony, he spoke about different kinds of love, how losing Sarah had taught him to treasure what he had while remaining open to new possibilities. Isabella's vows emphasized partnership and growth, promising to love not just Logan but the man he was becoming, the father he'd proven himself to be, and the dreams they would pursue together. She pledged to honor Sarah's memory by caring for the children and community Sarah had loved, understanding that her role wasn't replacement but continuation. The reception featured food prepared by the entire community, with Sweet Beginnings providing the wedding cake and bread for the feast. Logan and Isabella danced to a song that Sarah had loved, a gesture that felt like receiving permission to be happy rather than betraying sacred memory. The boys danced with Isabella, their joy uncomplicated and complete, as they celebrated gaining a mother who'd earned the title through patience and love, rather than biology alone. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Logan found himself standing outside the community center with his new wife and sons, looking at the town that had become home in ways he'd never expected. The lights of Sweet Beginnings glowed warmly in the distance, promising tomorrow's bread and the continuing rhythm of work that nourished their community. "No regrets?" Isabella asked softly, her hand finding his in the comfortable gesture that had become natural over their months of courtship. Logan considered the question seriously, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years earlier, he'd been a man defined by loss and struggle, convinced that survival was the highest goal he could achieve. The transformation from that desperate father to the happy husband and partner he'd become felt miraculous, but he understood now that miracles were often just the result of choosing hope over fear repeatedly until hope became habit. "None," he said finally, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "This is exactly where we're supposed to be." Jake and Ben ran ahead toward their house, their energy unlimited despite the long day. They called back to Logan and Isabella, urging them to hurry so they could start planning their next adventure. The sound of their voices, bright with possibility and secure in love, carried all the promise of the family they'd become and the future they would build together. Logan wrapped his arm around Isabella's shoulders as they walked home, her head fitting perfectly against his chest despite their significant height difference. The street was quiet except for their footsteps and the distant sound of the boys' laughter, but the silence felt full rather than empty, rich with contentment and the deep satisfaction of work well done. Sweet Beginnings would open as usual in the morning, serving fresh bread to neighbors who'd become friends and supporting the community that had embraced them all. Logan would coordinate tourism events that brought visitors to experience the authentic hospitality that made Millbrook special. The boys would continue growing, learning, and contributing to the family business that had become their second home. Most importantly, they would continue building on the foundation of love, respect, and shared purpose that had transformed a desperate single father's survival story into a thriving family's success. Logan had learned that he didn't have to choose between feeding his children and finding love, that the right partner would help him do both more effectively than he ever could have managed alone. As they reached their front door, Logan paused to look back at the bakery one more time, remembering the morning when Isabella had first offered him bread and he'd refused out of pride. The memory felt like it belonged to a different person, someone who'd confused independence with isolation and strength with stubbornness. That man had been afraid that accepting help would diminish him, never understanding that real strength came from building connections rather than maintaining walls. "Thank you," he said to Isabella, the words carrying weight that encompassed everything she'd given him, not just love, but the courage to believe he deserved it. "Thank you for letting me stay," she replied, understanding that his greatest gift had been trust, the willingness to open his heart and home to someone new after devastating loss. They went inside together, ready to begin the next chapter of their story, with the confidence that came from having already weathered storms and emerged stronger. The house was filled with the sounds of family life, cooking smells, and the comfortable chaos that meant home. Outside, Millbrook settled into peaceful evening quiet, secure in the knowledge that its community was strengthened by every love story that took root and flourished within its borders. Logan Reid had learned that love wasn't a luxury he couldn't afford, but a necessity that made everything else possible. In trying to feed his children, he'd discovered that nourishment came in many forms, and the best meals were always shared with people who mattered. Isabella Carter had found the home she'd been seeking in an unlikely place, with a stubborn giant of a man who'd needed to learn that accepting love wasn't surrender, but victory of the most important kind. Their story would continue, filled with the ordinary magic of daily life shared between people who chose each other every morning. There would be challenges ahead, decisions to make and problems to solve, but they would face everything together, as partners who'd learned that love multiplied rather than divided when it was built on foundation of respect, trust, and common purpose. The last lights in Sweet Beginnings went out as Isabella finished her final preparations for tomorrow's baking. Soon, the cycle would begin again, bread rising in the darkness to feed a community that had embraced them all. Logan Reid had discovered that he did need love after all, not as a replacement for caring for his children, but as the force that made every aspect of caring more meaningful, more sustainable, and infinitely more joyful than he'd ever imagined possible.